Begin. Hello, everyone. This is Vanya here. Welcome to my talk at TestFlix 2022. I am the head of technology for ThoughtWorks India. And besides that, I'm also a data mesh evangelist, and I help our clients bootstrap their data mesh journeys. And today I'm very excited to be talking about my experience on how can we shift data quality, which is a very important aspect in any data-driven journey, to be shifted left with the help of data mesh principles. Before we begin to dive deep, let's look at the data quality landscape. And even before that, let's look at some of the numbers. Now, this report is from New Vantage Partners 2022, based on AI, data and AI leadership executive interviews. And you can see that organizations that are pursuing their journeys to become data-driven, or they are pursuing their journeys to establish a data-driven culture, what are the top investments that they are looking at? And you would notice from this visual that data quality and data health sits as a top concern for organizations who are trying to become data-driven. Let's now sort of take a look at what are the aspects, or what does the problem space for data quality looks like. The first one is lack of trust on data and insights. I think this is a very, very common symptom that we have seen across many, many large organizations. I have personally seen many data initiatives, many transformation initiatives fail because the consumers of the data, or the consumers of the dashboards, reports, models, whatever it is, cannot trust the insights that are being generated, right? And the reason that those consumers cannot trust the insights is because they do not trust the data on which those insights are built, because they do not know how that data was collected. They do not know what's the lineage of that data. They do not know what sort of transformations and curations has that data gone through, and where does the garbling happening in between, if at all it's happening. So there is a very, very low trust on the data in the ecosystem, and therefore there is very low trust on the insights that are generated on top of that data. There's another symptom that we have observed, which is a problem space, and which is part of this overall problem space, which is the tendency to hoard or collect data. Now, this one is very interesting because I do not trust the data that others are producing or others are curating or transforming. So there is a tendency that I will only trust the data that exists within my boundary. So now I would try to get all the data that I need, even though if I'm not the rightful owner of that, into my boundary. So that's where the data hoarding aspect comes into place, right? And you would notice that there is some sort of a connotation of reinventing the wheel. I am trying to collect, measure the same data that rightfully belongs to some other department, but because I need it in some computations or transformations or reports that I own, I would want to hoard that data into my space, right? So that's another symptom that we have seen in this entire problem space of data quality. The third one is, how does it impede the innovation? Because there is that sort of a reinvention of the wheel happening at every stage, we are not looking at the bigger picture, right? It's impeding the overall innovation quotient of an organization, because everybody's trying to recreate what they can easily reuse from the other parts of their organization. So there is recreation over reuse. That's a mentality that's going around because of all the above three factors that we have considered. And ultimately, what it results in is it slows down the transformation efforts. Now, if you take a deeper look at the data quality as a topic that we are talking about today, there are some more deeper questions that arise. We spoke about, can we trust the data? But there are other nuances like, is this data even complete? Is this data even correct? Is this data timely? Right? Can I use this data at this point of time? Is it even worth using this data at this point of time? And with that, it's very important for us to understand what are the ways in which the data architectures are organized as of today, right? I'm sure all of us are very much aware of this, but on the left-hand side, we see the operational data world, right? Which talks about the operational systems that are serving the end consumers, which are helping the businesses serve the business capabilities to the end customers, right? Data on the inside. And in between, we have the huge data pipelines, the ETL, extract, transform, and load, which is taking data from all of these operational systems, transforming them, creating one big canonical model, one big large model that sort of fits together all of these data points. And then comes the analytical data plane, which talks about how can I leverage my data to optimize my business? How can I leverage my data to improve the user experience by generating insights, by generating analytics on top of that? Oftentimes, this central part that we see here is run and managed by a central business intelligence department or team, right? A huge team which has data talent, which has data engineers, data scientists, and many, many such more specialist roles, right? But then they are all sitting together as part of one team, away from the rest of the operational world, away from the rest of the product teams or the operational teams that are generating that data. Having looked at the traditional view of the data architectures or the data ecosystem at organizations, let's look at what are the problem points with such traditional centralized systems, right? There is ubiquitous data on the left-hand side, as I mentioned earlier. In a large organization where there are multiple digital initiatives, you can imagine that there is tons and tons of data that's getting generated. And then in between, there is a big data platform or big data team that is managed by a central team. And on the right-hand side is the innovation agenda, right? Where we are looking at increasing the operational efficiency of our systems, where we are looking at increasing the operational efficiency of our business. This is sort of a landscape that we talk about, right? If you notice the smileys on the screen, right? The people on the left-hand side who are just throwing the data over this big wall are the happy lot, because they don't have to care or they don't have to worry about what's happening with that data, because as long as their operational systems are up and running and serving the end customers, they are happy about it, to be able to throw their data over the wall into the central platform in the custody of the central team and leave it for them to understand what that data means. The consumers of the data insights are unhappy because they are not meeting their expectations. Their expectations are not getting met in time. And the central team members are, of course, the unhappiest of the lot, because they have absolutely no clue how to understand the data that they are taking or ingesting from rest of the organization, and they do not understand what would be the best way to represent that data so that the consumers can be delighted, right? But you can already see that the data shape, that the ubiquitous data that's existent in the organization is different from the shape of the data that is required from an innovation, right? And the questions that oftentimes are asked but not expressed openly by these central teams is, what are the constraints for this data? What does this data even mean? Then it's very easy to say that cost of fixing the data quality, it keeps on increasing as we move closer towards the consumer. And it's very simple to say that the cost of fixing the data quality, because I understand the data quality rules, is the cheapest when I'm trying to fix that right at the source, right? And that's where I think it's important for us to now look at data mesh principles and how data mesh principles are going to help us address some of the issues that we have spoken about before, and also talk about specifically the data quality aspects that we want to channelize with the principles of data mesh. So data mesh is a decentralized socio-technical approach to manage the analytical data at scale. And this is designed to solve the issues that arise because of the gap that exists between the data consumers and the data producers. As I was mentioning earlier, because the distance between the data consumers and the data producers is so high, oftentimes there are challenges that arise on how should we make sense of the analytical data, right? And that's what data mesh helps us to solve. These are the 4 principles of data mesh: domain ownership, data as a product, self-serve data infrastructure, and federated computational governance. All these 4 principles work together in tandem to facilitate each other. Domain ownership, the domain that understands that data, the people or the teams that understand that data are the ones that also own the analytical data that they have, right? And as a domain team, if I'm order management team and in a retail setup, I understand orders. I understand the operational natures of the order, because I help my customers interact with the systems to place orders, to create orders, to update orders, to delete orders, to modify orders. That's the domain part of the orders, right? Now, the second aspect is data as a product. Now, historically, data has always been looked as a second-class citizen, right? And therefore, this tendency to throw this data over the wall. Right? But when we start talking about data as a product, we are looking at what are the needs of my consumers. We are looking at what are the ways in which I can delight my consumers. The third one is self-serve data infrastructure. Now, we are talking about decentralizing the domain ownership, but we are not talking about decentralizing the infrastructure. So there's a difference here, right? We do talk about how do you start owning your own data? How do you establish that ownership on top of your own data, specifically the analytical data? But how can we enable the teams to own their own data and build products on top of that? That's where the self-serve data infrastructure comes into play, because this platform is going to allow the product teams to build the data products. And last but not the least comes the aspect of federated computational governance, where we are talking about how do we still, in a decentralized setup, have the ideas and have the concerns and have the perspective of the different domains included while we are looking at the standards. Now, having understood the principles of data mesh at a very high level, let's look at how can data mesh principles help in shifting the data quality left. Let's look at the first one. Because we are talking about domain-oriented ownership, where we are talking about the team that produces the data to own the analytical data and insights that are getting generated on top of the data, it helps in creating a better understanding of the data quality rules of that domain. The second aspect of data as a product, I'm looking at who are my consumers and what are their needs. Because, as I said earlier, the product thinking allows us to think about what would delight my consumers. And when I'm thinking about the delight of my consumers, and when I'm thinking about my product, one of the success metrics for a product is how many people use it, right? How many people are delighted by it. And therefore, it would allow me, or it would give me the right impulse and right motivation to publish my data quality metrics such that I can build trust, such that I can expose that information much more available, much more readily to the consumer world out there, that if you use my data, these are the benefits, right? If you use my data, these are the freshness metrics. These are the other SLOs in terms of availability, in terms of performance, in terms of lineage, in terms of how this data was transformed. All of those metrics about my data can be published in a dashboard or in some fashion in a visualization manner, such that my consumers can take a conclusive decision on, yes, this is the right data for me to experiment with, or this is the right data for me to create my insights on top of, right? So you can see that how the trust aspect of on the data that we spoke of as a principle or as a challenge in the data quality landscape is now getting addressed when I'm starting to think about data as a product. Then the self-serve data platform allows for automating a lot of data quality challenges. It helps us in creating frameworks where the domain teams can supply their data quality rules, and automatically when the data travels through the platform capabilities, those rules can apply and bad data can be called out or bad data can be pointed out, and then the fixing can happen, right? The ability for the platform to automate all of these capabilities at scale without reinventing the wheel at each and every team level is a great way to make sure that we are nipping the bud right when it's trying to open up its face and not doing this downstream. So if we are automating functionalities like data lineage, how do we observe the data? What sort of transformations is the data going through? And what are the bad data points based on the rules of that domain that is coming from the domain itself? The self-serve platform helps us in automating and achieving those prerogatives. And last but not the least, from a federated computational governance perspective, how do we establish mesh level consistency and reliability and data quality enforcement, right? For instance, if there are some data standards that I want to enforce in an automated way, in a computational way, I can take help from my self-serve platform and make sure that those data standards are upheld when the data is getting processed, right? And automatically, such that it's embedded and codified within the platform itself and does not become like a manual process at a later point of time. And from a federated computational governance perspective, it helps us to establish some consistent and reliable rules at the mesh level itself, because we are talking about the entire mesh at this point of time, right? And all of these things together, when we put them in perspective, we would see that it helps us in addressing the trust issues on the data that we spoke of earlier, because now the domain who produces the data is also producing the insights top of that data. It helps us to reduce the reinvention of the wheel, because there's going to be reuse. If I know for sure that the data that the order management team is producing is accurate because they have published all of their metrics, I'm going to trust that data. And if I'm a customer domain and I still need the order data to build recommendations for my future customers, I'm going to trust that data, right? So we will save the problem of reinvention, or we will save the problem of not reusing, but recreating and reinventing all the time. I hope this presentation was helpful for you. I know this was a very short format. If you have any more questions, detailed questions, I'll be happy to answer. You can reach out to me on Twitter or on LinkedIn, and I'll be happy to take any questions in those channels as well. Thank you so much.